Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. The show has been running for over 6 years now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to Rosa Whiteley. Rosa is a designer, writer and researcher who trained as an architect at Manchester and subsequently the Royal College of Art. Since then, she's worked within Cooking Sections, the Turner Prize-nominated design and art collective founded by Daniel Fernandez-Pascual and Alain Schwebe, as a project manager and lead researcher. And since 2021, she's been the director of material research for CLIMAVORE, which is a long-term site-responsive project exploring how to eat as humans change climates and how to metabolize climate breakdown. As we'll find out, she's been working on the islands of Skye and Raasay in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland to develop building materials from waste seashells. When she's not doing that, she also teaches at the RCA and is currently a fellow of the Onassis Foundation. Hi, Rosa. Thanks so much for doing this. Was that reasonably accurate?
Yes, it was. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me.
That's my absolute and complete pleasure. Thank you very much for doing it. We had to squeeze this interview in before you went away for, a couple of months, 3 months. Where are you going? What are you doing? Tell it all.
I am off to Athens very soon, next week. I'm doing a research residency at Onassis, like you mentioned. And so, I'm very excited. I'm going for 2.5 months. And it will be a great time to be in Athens.
Very good. Yeah. Very good. Well, we'll maybe get into that towards the back end of the interview. We have a tradition on this podcast of trying to sort of locate our guest to give listeners a sense of where and how they work. You don't look like you're at work at the moment. Let's put it that way. Where are you right now?
I'm currently at my partner's house. And so right next to Welsh Street Common, hearing lots and lots of birds, which is very nice. Normally I'd be at Somerset House, which is where we have studios, where Cooking Sections has their studios. And if not, I'd be somewhere because I guess we move around quite a lot with our different projects, and do work abroad sometimes too. But mostly, at Somerset House. Very good.
Very good. Well, look, I came across you earlier this year when you gave a talk at a conference at the V&A called Made Well. And you discussed the project that you've been working on for several years now on the islands of Skye and Raasay in the Inner Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland. It's part of your work for CLIMAVORE. I mean, in the first instance, can we talk about CLIMAVORE? It's an organisation that came out of Cooking Sections, isn't it?
Yes. It started in 2015 in the Isle of Skye and Raasay. And it was started by Alan and Daniel, my colleagues at Cooking Sections. And it's broadly looking at how you can eat as humans change the climate. And CLIMAVORE now has many projects. The one in the Isle of Skye is not the only one. There's projects based in Italy and Istanbul. And all of them kind of address an exhaustive food system or a very extractive food system or situation going on, and try and suggest alternatives and try and kind of promote alternative ways of practicing, living and growing food and all of that.
Okay.
And on the Isle of Skye and Raasay, that's CLIMAVORE Community Interest Company, and that's where I work most closely with.
Okay, so CLIMAVORE's first project was on Skye.
Yeah.
Can we talk about how it all began?
Yes. So it all began many years ago, around 2014, 2015. Alan and Daniel from Cooking Sections were invited by Atlas Arts, an arts organisation based there, who kind of see the whole island as their gallery. Like the whole island can be somewhere where art exists and is installed. And Alan and Daniel first did an artist residency there and then created this commission, which was an oyster table that was installed in the tidal region in Portree, one of the main towns in the Isle of Skye. And its mission was to address salmon farming on the island, which is something we could discuss at great length.
Well, maybe we should at least touch on it a little bit, because it is the issue. It is the reason for the whole project and why this project has been going on for 7, 8+ years. What is the problem with farmed salmon?
So farmed salmon, if you're eating salmon in the UK or really anywhere at this point, unless you're very lucky, it's farmed salmon. And farmed salmon is very destructive to the environment around the place that it's grown, because they're put in these pens that are in the tidal regions or in the open sea, and they're hundreds and hundreds of thousands. They're very, very dense in these pens. And salmon are normally kind of swimming huge expanses to get their food and to breed. And when they're in these pens, many things happen. They could get diseases like lice, where then they're treated with insecticides, and those insecticides damage the seabed and damage all the critters in the seabed. Also, sewage goes, like there's an open sewer. So we can imagine all the things that happen when you have basically like they're in a net and that net has holes and all these things escape. Also, another thing to consider is that sometimes they escape and they breed with their wild counterparts who do still exist, even though they're rare and protected. And then that can make their kind of offspring a little bit weaker and a little bit less likely to manage the runs up the rivers, because farmed salmon are much smaller and less muscular because they don't really move as much. And then one final thing I think is important to note is that they're fed fish. They're fed fish pellets, and those fish are caught off the coasts of like Western Africa, off the coast of Peru. And they're like those tiny fish like sardines. And they're really traditionally important like food sources and protein sources. And it completely strips that kind of access to that protein on those coastlines.
So it takes fish from other human communities, in other words.
Yeah. And it mills them down into fish oil and fish meal, takes it up to places like Norway, Scotland, and other places, and feeds it to fish in order for then the populations of those countries to just get kind of bigger, differently tasting fish, which to me sometimes is the biggest contradiction with them all, given like huge amounts of food insecurity in the world.
Reading a little bit around this, the salmon fish being farmed, they're also fed antidepressants and I didn't know this, they're fed colour tablets. So they're not pink naturally.
No, they're not. They would be grey, but they get fed they get fed pink. They get fed it. Astaxanthin is the chemical, and that would be the chemical they get from krill in the open ocean, and that's what makes them pink, like same as flamingo. But they in the farms, they just get what they're fed. And so they feed them the kind of petrochemical dye version of that in order to make sure that the salmon in the supermarkets is the right shade of pink. And there's this whole industry around it. Like they've kind of made the perfect color for the like salmon color expectations in Northern Europe compared to like places in Asia that might expect a deeper red. And there's like a whole market around how you get the right color of salmon.
Like a Pantone book of salmon color.
Yeah. It's called a Samofan.
Right.
And it's like these 16 to 20 colors of salmon that you can pick from.
Wow. I did not know that. That's really interesting. So we have the problem, we have the location. What steps did CLIMAVORE cooking sections, as it was then, what steps did they take? Because the project started with a multi-species intertidal table, 2017. That's a very long title for something.
Yes.
What is precisely a multi-species intertidal table, and how did it function?
So, yeah, in 2015, this was the kind of installation that was aimed at addressing salmon, and it was installed in a tidal zone, which meant that it like changed as the tides changed. So at high tide, this table was underwater, and it was kind of providing habitat for these oysters, but also other shellfish like mussels and scallops, and also like a massive range of seaweeds. As the year went on, the seaweeds grew and grew and grew. And then at low tide, when the tide disappeared off, it was a table where there was a lot of discussions, performative meals, talks from local residents, activists, scientists, policymakers, school children, you name it. And it was all broadly discussing like how to address salmon farming and what to do next, or what alternatives were like good to think about. Another thing that happened during that time is that we worked with many restaurants to remove salmon from their menus, which is actually quite a difficult thing to do when tourism is so important in the Isle of Skye, and people expect Scottish salmon. But we worked with like a range of amazing restaurants that removed salmon, and they also had CLIMAVORE apprentices from local schools that kind of were cookery apprentices that developed CLIMAVORE meals. And the kind of agreement of what a CLIMAVORE meal was that it would involve something like mussels, scallops, oysters, bivalves, seaweeds, or marsh greens, but things generally that filter as they grow and that improve the environmental conditions that they grow within.
Yes, I'm interested by this because this seems to be your main answer to the salmon farming problem, is to eat mussels, clams, scallops, oysters, that kind of thing. How do they improve the environment?
Well, say you have a shellfish, starting with the like bivalve families. The only way they feed is to filter. So they have these little filters that draw in all of the particles of the ocean. And it means that oysters are very well known, and all the other shellfish are very well known to like improve water quality because they're constantly filtering it. So they can filter like a mad amount of litres every hour. And so they're quite regularly used as kind of bioremediator in order to clean polluted areas. But in general, when you have these creatures farmed, they're constantly improving by filtering out nasties, but also like just clarifying the water because they're removing all the held particulates. And so they really clearly like improve the environment. Seaweeds also, I mean, they're a carbon store, but they also reduce ocean acidification. And, you know, like in the same way that trees in a woodland create the environment, so do seaweeds create like underwater forests in a way.
So is this your tidal orchard that I was reading about? What is a tidal orchard?
So the tidal orchard is a very long-term dream of ours that we're yet to see happen fully, which is to consider how this tidal region can be food. We do that a lot already and like organize foraging workshops and like teaching people what kind of foods from the coast you can eat. And it's basically like anything. But what we'd really like to do with some of the community trusts that we work with is install a tidal orchard or a tidal garden. And that would use small structures and like gardening techniques to encourage the growth of certain seaweeds and certain bivalves as well. And so you can do really simple things, like you can clear a circular area around a stone that's growing a certain species, like dulse, that's like expensive but also really delicious. You could also like insert structures, and that's something that we did a test on to see what materials we could use, because we wanted to use all natural materials. But for now, it's quite hard to get licensing to install structures in the tidal zone. There's all kind of like ownership and different laws. And so it's something we're really actually trying to hopefully push in the next few years, but we haven't yet made our garden in such a big way as that we'd want.
Fair enough. But there are like 3 pillars to the project, I think I'm right in saying, which is what? Regrowing, rebuilding, and relearning. What does all that entail? I
guess regrowing, like, is that it's kind of thinking about how you can use the tidal zone as an allotment or an orchard, just like inland, or also like as a croft, which is like a really traditional like way of using land and farming land in Scotland. Relearning centers around all of our kind of efforts to kind of educate and make workshops. And so we work a lot with different local schools, as I mentioned, to have apprentices within restaurants that we work with. We also kind of have done lots of workshops with chefs going into the schools and teaching people how to shuck a oyster, or teaching people how to like cook seaweeds, because these are really traditional foods that have fed the coast of England for generations, but people aren't taught how to eat them anymore. And so many workshops and kind of educational events, that's more relearning, like learning how to understand these foods and understand the environment in different ways. And then rebuilding is probably the one that I'm definitely most involved in, which probably started around 2020, 2021 more seriously. And it's basically the process by which we collect waste shells from the restaurants that we work with. They had started to be like, we're making a lot of like shellfish waste here because you can't do anything with the shells. And you also can't, many years ago, you would have been able to put them in the ocean, but it's actually illegal to do that now. And so they go to landfill and it's quite expensive.
Why is it illegal to put shells back into the ocean?
I think it's to do with biofouling.
Okay.
And so like not wanting to have any pathogens or diseases like re-enter the ocean. And it's that, I believe. I wish I had a clearer answer there.
It never even occurred to me, put them back into the ocean. Why not? But you can't, which is intriguing. Did you run into any complaints? I mean, all the talks and stuff I've read, seems like everybody was behind you and everything was hunky-dory. But presumably there's some pretty powerful vested interests running these salmon farms who are on the island who weren't so keen on you upending their business.
I mean, there's a few different answers I could say. I wouldn't say we're upending their business right now.
Okay.
They're doing okay.
Yeah. Well,
it is really contentious on the Isle of Skye and other places to talk about salmon farming, and people are very sensitive to it. I think really we'd prefer talking about the alternatives and like alternative ways of eating, but also like making buildings, making products, and like we focus on, I guess, the alternatives because it's less controversial. But also in a way more hopeful. I think it's something that I enjoy in all of our projects, that it's more about thinking beyond things. And then in situations like we removed salmon, we worked with restaurants and cafes in different museums and galleries across the UK to agree to remove salmon.
Including the Tate and Serpentine and some pretty big institutions.
Yeah, that was really amazing. That was during the nomination for the Turner Prize.
Right.
And that was, I guess what's interesting there is that it's not really us doing that. We're asking people to do that. And so there has been some kind of challenges from maybe like people related to the salmon industry, but it's more like aimed at those institutions and not so much us.
Till now. So, I should mention that Cooking Sections were nominated for the Turner Prize in 2021. The relationship with Tate Britain started there. So you have all these shells and there's all this food waste that you've created because these restaurants are changing their menus. You decided to make building materials out of the shells. How did you go about doing that?
Well, people have always made building materials out of the shells. It's an age-old way of making buildings. As long as we've had like mortar between stone, as long as we've eaten shells on the coasts, which before like the industrialization of our coasts, like was a very common thing. And so I'd say like it seemed quite clear or obvious that maybe that was a potentially useful building material. It is also made out of calcium carbonate, as is stone and cement, and much of the structures are bones as well. And so like it's kind of like something that presents a kind of usefulness to something that might be structural. And so I guess we started by trying to understand how people had used them in the past. And they'd used them in the past through mostly across coastal regions, across the world, from burning them and crushing them and mixing that with water to make a kind of proto-cement, like a very early cement. And these still exist today, many of these buildings, and people talk and discuss about how strong and hard this like shell, cement and shell.
Is this tubby concrete?
Yeah, this is tabby concrete. If you're kind of in the south of the US, they'd more call it that. And there's some like massive examples of that. In Skye, they used it, I guess, more for like mortar. If you go into the basement of lots of buildings in Edinburgh, you'll see holes fixed with shells, and you'll like, if you study the mortar, you'll understand it to be from shells, because Edinburgh used to have so many oyster houses from the Firth of Forth. That was like a massive oyster source for the whole city. And it kind of like was the cheap food that fed everyone whilst they were having a pint, you know? And so they have like walls fixed with many, many shells. And you also see it in certain places in the Hebrides, not necessarily in Skye, but in some of the islands above it. They didn't have a lime seam, which is like they didn't have limestone. So they couldn't make lime, which is what we're talking about. Burning shells is making lime. And so they made most of their lime from shells and shell middens, which are like kind of ancient rubbish piles from people.
So you have the shells and you have the idea to make this cement or lime from it. Presumably then you need to build the infrastructure to create this material. I mean, you need collecting, cleaning, processing. What did you have to do?
Well, yeah, it's a lot. Even just collecting the shells, there's a lovely woman, Rachel, who's been collecting them for a long time for us. And that involves driving to many different locations in Skye because the restaurants are spread out and it's not a small island. So we collect the shells firstly. All the restaurants have like a dedicated box, like next to their recycling boxes, which are for the shells. And then we store them on someone's croft. And there's just a huge shell midden that grows and grows and grows. That is like all of that season. We collect it during the tourist season, I should say, because that's when the restaurants are really operating and that's when the most waste is produced. And so then each tourist season is kind of stored on the croft. And that's when a bit of digestion happens. Some kind of different insects and bugs eat away some of those meals as well. And we leave it to weather as well, and they get a little bit more clean. And then we have to clean them all properly so that we don't make tiles that smell of fish. And so we soak them in like an oxygen bleach. We're actually now trying soaking them in our own lime because that should also work. And once they're clean, we crush some and we burn some, and then we make a tile.
Okay. The cleaning, that's all being done by hand? I mean, you literally put it into buckets or vats, or how does this work?
Vats. Definitely vats. We're not talking huge volumes. If you talk to a kind of actual tile producer, they're like, this is crazy small. But for us, it's quite big because there's not many of us. And so, yeah, they're soaked in those big kind of like meter by a meter by a meter vats, many of them, and allowed to kind of soak for a while. But by then, they're actually really, once they've been weathered in the storms that happen in Skye, quite a lot is taken off of them and they're okay.
And then crushed and then burned. And then what happens then?
So we crush them with a crusher. We have like a hammer mill, and sometimes we hire a bigger one. And the burning is like a very fun process that we could talk about it, but we're trying to move away from it. But the burning to make lime is like the really traditional, that's how people have made building materials for millennia. And so we have like Joel Franklin, who like runs our workshop and does a lot of this work that I'm talking about. He built a kind of purpose-built lime kiln for us, and we burn the shells in a very specific way that he's kind of improved over time with wood, because you want actually a lot of like impurities. You want the impurities that come from like having some organic matter there. And so we burn it with wood so that the lime has a good amount of impurities, because that's what makes it even stronger. And then it gets burned and then it gets taken out and it's had all the oxygen driven off it. And then you add water and it goes from calcium carbonate, which is shells, and then you burn it and you get calcium oxide. And that's really reactive and a little bit dangerous, and you have to really like know how to deal with it. And then you add water and then it bubbles loads. It's like an exothermic reaction. It's very dramatic and kind of fun, but also like pillars and pillars of smoke. And that becomes calcium hydroxide, which is like the lime that we want. And that is then still processed through kind of almost as if you're making cheese, like hung with cheesecloths to get rid of some water. And eventually it makes like a putty, like a kind of, like a putty, like it's the right consistency that we want. And we use that to bind the shells.
And then you can create tiles.
Yes, that's what we've been up to thus far, yeah.
Hope you're enjoying the show. This is to remind you that Material Matters Copenhagen is running from the 18th to the 20th of June at Gammeldock, Christianshavn, and is part of the 3 Days of Design Festival. We will have the likes of Hydro, AHEC Europe, The New Raw, Abalon, iFungi, Spark & Bell and Patch Studio taking part, to name just a few. There'll also be a special installation from Ukraine House that investigates sourcing materials in a war zone. We can't tell you how much we're looking forward to it at Material Matters. And if you're in Copenhagen, do come in and have a look. There'll be some wonderful installations and genuinely inspiring products. Plus, you can say hello to William and I. Check out our website for more details at materialmatters.design. I should also mention that our London Fair returns to the London Design Festival 2025 from the 17th to the 20th of September, and what's more, it has a sparkling new home. We're taking a floor of Space House, one of the city's most distinctive modernist buildings on the outskirts of Covent Garden. The building is filling up with some fascinating things, but there is still space if you're keen to take part. drop us a line at hello@materialmatters.design. That's hello@materialmatters.design. You've made the point in talks that I've seen online that architecture used to be intimately connected with food culture. Can we unpick that a little bit? How was it and how did it stop being connected?
Well, it was in lots of ways. You could use the shells as an example because people now don't gather food like they used to in coastal regions from the coast. People would go and kind of gather mussels, and then they would have leftover mussel shells and maybe use those shells to, as I said, fix a hole in the building. In other situations, when you have things like wheat or grain farming and you get those kind of long sheafs that actually a lot of it is waste, that traditionally would have gone on to be a thatch or something like that. And you might get different types of thatch depending on if it was more of a wheat growing area or a rye growing area, or like it would kind of be more dependent on those things. But huge industrialization of our landscapes and our fields has meant that there's not, I think, as much like quick transition between one household growing some food and then that having a waste that you can then integrate within your building systems. Wastes are like much bigger, and then they're also used for other things. Like they're probably used for biofuel right now for things like that used to be used for thatch. And it's kind of, I think it's important to think about because it's this mass industrialization that have separated us from our landscapes. Like we're not, I don't know, you and I don't think are the ones farming the fields.
I am definitely not farming fields, no.
Most people maybe are not, that are the ones that also then run the food factories and kind of follow that process through. And we're all quite separated from our environments unless you really try and make sure that it's not something that is just like allowed to us, that we get to be in the tidal zones or in the fields. And so you don't see so much of these processes that you could then integrate within your life. And I think that's one of those separations as well, of like you won't see the waste shells that you could then use within your buildings or the agricultural waste. Just a big cultural separation. And that I think has led, some of our other material cultures to be separated, and which previously were very integrated.
So how many people, Rosa, are working on this project as we speak?
Whoa. We can do a tally up. So there's Shona Cameron. She's like the director of CLIMAVORE in the Isle of Skye. She probably is working on this project as we speak right now. There's Joel Franklin, who, as I said, runs the workshop. And then he normally, it's quite fluid, but often has different apprentices and people helping him. And so let's say that's 4 so far. And then Rachel, who collects the shells. It's probably like 5 to 6. I think I counted myself, but I'm not sure. And then also, it's not full time, I would say.
Right.
But in general, probably around 10 people work on the CLIMAVORE CIC project.
And are you doing things like taking on apprenticeships? Are you teaching these skills? I mean, you talked about going to schools. Are you teaching people about their landscape and what you can create from your landscape?
Yeah, we've done in the past. It's something that I'd really like to continue, is this construction skills workshop or like kind of module with the local construction school, where we invited different architects and makers in to teach students how to do things like thatch with seaweed, or make insulation out of like different tidal greens and seaweeds, and also with our processes, how to make lime from shells. And so that was a really great syllabus I'd like to see continued, because they were kind of interested in how you make it more permanent within the school. And then also, we have apprentices coming in and out of the workshop, which always works really well, and continue to do lots of school workshops with different local schools. With the tiles that we've been making at the moment, we've made these murals that are getting installed across different spaces in Skye that could be good to talk about. But whilst we were developing the designs for those, we did workshops in schools to kind of talk about their relationships to the coast and different stories around kind of coastal cultures. And they developed their own artworks that then have kind of informed in different ways what we were doing with our murals as well.
Very good. you have preempted my next question, which is always a joy, which is, so we got to the process, we got to the number of people making it, and you got to an education element of it. You've got these tiles that you've produced on the island. What have you done with them so far? There are murals. Let's talk about murals.
Yes, there are murals. So I guess I think it's useful to say that what we have done, even before the murals, is kind of use different artistic commissions to develop this material. So we were also developing this material originally working towards an exhibition we did at the Royal Botanic Gardens, where we made 400 tiles for this floor piece. And it's kind of a useful way to have enough space and freedom to experiment with material production, or at least we found it very useful. And then in this case, over the last 2 or 3 years, even now, 2 years, I think, we've been making these murals that we call bivalve murals. And they're called bivalve murals because there's 5 designs, but in each design there's 2 of them and they're mirrored. So it's like 2 sides of a shell. So one of those murals is getting installed in a public space in Skye. So there's one getting installed at the Gaelic University, Samarostig, and others in schools or community halls. And they're all going to be kind of publicly accessible pieces of public art and are often related to communities that we already work with on many other things. The other ones are getting sold as artworks to different art collections, like public-facing art collections. And the sale of those is funding the production and installation of the murals in Skye, but also it's funding the kind of further work that we're doing around developing this material in order to scale up.
Yeah, let's talk about scaling up, because also let's talk about techniques, because it's kind of changing. I think when I've done some reading around this, you're not using so much heat, or you're investigating pressure instead of heat.
Yes. I love making lime out of shells, and that uses heat. And so we're exploring ways not to use heat, which is moving away from the lime, or at least reducing our kind of dependence on it. Because it's nowhere near as much heat as like a cement factory, but it is also, using carbon to burn. So we've kind of been preparing for a few years for this shift and talking to many material scientists about alternatives of processing these shells. And a big one for us has been a hydraulic press, and experiments that we've been doing, kind of moving around other people's workshops that have let us in, using their presses to mill the shells and press them and make tiles that way. And we actually, in very early tests, have had some quite exciting results, which inspired us to recently buy and install our first press, which is great. And we're doing a kind of 9 months research and development starting around now. With funding from Innovate UK to push that and to figure out if it's an avenue for us. Because if we can do it with a press, then it's obviously the electricity that goes into powering the press, but in general, it's a very low energy in comparison process. And yeah, we're getting some quite exciting results. So that's really great. And we're kind of seeing it as I think the lime process, the lime cycle is what you call it, the kind of chemicals I described of calcium to calcium oxide. That's really geological already, because you're kind of considering how a rock can get transformed by heat into then another substance and then eventually that lime or calcium hydroxide that I mentioned, as that absorbs carbon dioxide as it goes off, which can take up to 6 years in some cases, but it will start being pretty off after 3 months or 6 months. That then turns back to calcium carbonate. So it's kind of like a cyclical thing. And that to me is very geological. But then when we go to the press tiles and we think of we're trying to make stone out of shells and we want to do it quickly to make a viable business model and a viable material. But we're kind of doing it in a geological way with pressure. And so we talk about it in a way of accelerating geology and trying to learn from the processes that happen when rocks make rocks, or shells make rocks underground, to do that, which would be fun.
Absolutely. And what does scaling up look like? as far as you're concerned? What's the ambition? How many tiles per annum would you be thinking of?
So I would say that it kind of depends on this next round of research, because then we'll know a little bit more if it's a big tile or a little tile, which would then change that because you get a lot more pressure on smaller tiles. However, the ambition, so I just to explain, like, the ambition isn't just, it is to make a viable building material. But for us, what's most exciting about that, like, I never thought I'd set out in my career or life to be like very passionate about making just a really good building material. And I am much more than I expected. But what I think all of us are really excited about is the potential for that to be a community-owned industry or business that feeds all of its profits back into the community that it's from. And so hopefully we make a business that is making profit, and that we can then have a kind of system where different board members from the community decide where those profits go. And it will be towards community projects that centre ecology and like social change. And that's what's most exciting. And so in that way, I want it to be massive so we can make loads of money. But I think in reality, there is like a limit to that scale, because there's a limit to how many shells you get from restaurants. And there's a limit to how many, I don't know, like right now, a limit to how many people who are available to do that work and all these things. So it's a bit of a like, we're going to wait and see. But I think the main ambition of Scale is that it can kind of look after itself, and that it can like actually provide a kind of common good, which is something that we're already focused on. It's why it's turned into a 10-year project that hopefully will become a 20-year project and beyond. It's that we want to kind of work in those timescales and like really challenge the more economic and social side of these questions.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, because I was going to ask, is CLIMAVORE on Skye for good? I mean, do you see an endpoint to this project, or is it invested generationally?
I think we'd all hope it's invested generationally. I think there is a thing, I guess, which I'm sure many people would think, is that I am based in London and it's happening in the Isle of Skye. And I've been working on this project through my work with cooking sections and also my interest in making materials out of shells for a long time. And I am, and we all are, more interested, I guess, in it being a long-term project, but really driven by people in Skye. And so I think we are going to probably go through a kind of transitional time where we transition some of that work. And I mean, the ownership has already transitioned. It's a community interest company and all of that. But I guess we're quite keen for it to be taken up in Skye more, and to employ more people on Skye, and to, at the right time, step back in order for that to happen. How
do you know when that right time is?
It's probably, to be honest, like quite soon. But I think it's just when it doesn't need people so much to, and that's why I say it's quite soon, because it kind of doesn't. But it also is useful, I guess, to have support also from, we're like working with lots of different institutions to do this research, and also with RCA that we work with. And so, we're in the transitional time, but hopefully it like lasts forever or whatever. But it only makes sense, and it would only make sense for it to last that long if it was really through communities in Skye.
Sure. One of the things I'm interested in both a talk that I've seen you give and an article I read by Alon and Daniel, is you have concerns about the circular economy. I'm going to try and paraphrase you here a little bit, but what I took away is that you think there's a danger that people could use it as an excuse to create more waste. I mean, would that be a fair way of describing it? I mean, in the article, they describe it as, and I'm going to quote here, monetizing waste streams for individual or corporate profit. And they talk instead about a commoning economy, which is, and again, I'll quote, monetizing waste for wealth distribution. So can we talk about your, I guess, qualms about the circular economy?
Yes, it's something that we speak about a lot in the studio. And I would say that like maybe we don't have any clear answers, but I think what you do see in waste economies often is that the waste is monetized. And by monetizing that waste, waste is monetized, and maybe we're thinking about like more industrial processes, industrial agriculture, or like petrochemicals, or like industrial meat production, the waste is monetized, and by monetizing that waste, it it increases the profits of those businesses, because they don't have to dealing with waste traditionally has been so expensive, and it has constricted the growth of industries. And if we have a real celebration of the use of waste and a monetization of the use of waste, you also kind of improve the economic situation of the companies producing the waste. And the thing is that the biggest waste streams are quite often from the more industrial big companies. And I think there's lots of examples where that does happen. I think you can see it in like the recycling plastic industry, that is kind of like widely understood as being contradictory and a bit like more complex than it is advertised. You see it in the meat industry of like rendered meats, actually in some cases providing huge profit streams to businesses because they make all kind of profits from them. And it's something that we've always been really aware of, I think, because we use waste, and that I think we're just always challenging ourselves of like to what ends and what means. And like, it's similar, I think, to what I was saying in that we're interested in material production for like also the social and economic change, not just the material change. And I think in this case, this is like, as you quoted Alan and Daniel, like we're interested in it towards efforts to increase kind of commoning and common ownership. And that we hope is like a bit of a departure from some of the waste economies that you see that I think use it to kind of turbocharge their efforts towards mass consumption.
Alan and Daniel also talked about wanting to create the tidal commons, I guess inspired by the project in Skye. I know you can't speak for them, but what might the tidal commons look like? How might it work?
I think the tidal commons is something that we often return back to. And I think it's one of those main aims or like future aims that we're always trying to like steer our plans to work towards. I think in a really like utopic way, it would be open access and like non-ownership of the coasts in order to access food and access recreation. And that's like a really utopic answer to that. I think the more simple or like other versions of that is to have kind of tidal areas that are public access, but also like publicly owned, and not necessarily even just publicly owned, but like community owned, and really recognizing that community ownership and management improves the ecology of places and the like longevity of those ecologies, and that people have to be centered into the management of our coastal regions. And so tidal commoning, just like movements to have more common spaces in the land and common ownership, is kind of about the rights to access and own those spaces, and the importance of people being involved in the kind of management of land and access to land for their own means, for food and for economy and income, but the importance of their presence also for the ecology of that land too.
Can we talk a little about you, Rosa?
Yeah.
Good. You look very nervous then. You trained as an architect, as I said, first at Manchester, then the Royal College of Art. So when you first went to Manchester, did you want to create buildings? Was that the idea at the time?
Oh, I was just a little baby then. I don't think so. I think looking back, I was really interested in architectural education. I was really interested in like understanding how spaces and environments are made and how they might be remade, and like all the different many beings, be it humans or more than humans, that make them. I was also interested in buildings, and I still am, but yeah, I think I was always much more leaning towards like research into the environments and understanding it in a much more broader sense. I think that's why I was very excited by architectural education, but then maybe less excited when I worked in architecture because I wanted to be focusing much more on environments and research.
So you did work in architecture for a while?
Yes, I did. I did my part one in architecture before going to RCA, which was great. I mean, I learned a lot, but I also learned that I didn't think it was for me. So by the time I was going to RCA, I was very much on the course of like really enjoying studying, like really loving it, but not really sure how I could move beyond studying and still get to do those kind of things.
Did you have a sense of what you wanted to do at the Royal College of Art? Your graduation project was all about pink toxic clouds in Russia, or the Russian-Finnish border, right? Is that what you imagined doing when you first arrived?
No, probably not. I actually think I went quite naive. People sometimes are like, do you need a plan when you go? And like, I just was very excited to be there and to focus. I guess I knew what I wanted to do, is focus on like environmental systems and extractive systems and kind of understand how people made projects about that, which is kind of what I ended up trying to do. But yeah, I think I had also a level of naivety to me that didn't have a clear plan.
And how did you end up working at cooking sections?
Alan and Daniel were my tutors in first year. So they taught me in my first year. We were doing a project called Offsetting the Offshore. And everyone was doing kind of coastal projects. And I was looking into oil rigs in Scotland and the kind of cold sea reefs that grow on their legs. So looking a lot into mussels. And I guess that was one of the reasons why they, at some point, offered me a job, to my delight. And so I started working with them in the first year of my master's and continued through the second year, and then have continued since then.
Very good. I'm intrigued by your mention of oil, because one of the things I was looking at on your website was this project you did on oil critters. Mm-hmm. What is an oil critter?
Well, I was seeing oil critters. This is a residency I did with Heat Island, a practice in North London, straight after uni when COVID was still wobbling about. I see oil critters as critters or creatures that kind of are actively not existing, but kind of like the way they're acting in the environment is because of the oil industry. So I called the blue mussel an oil critter because if you look at a map of like blue mussel populations in the North Sea, it directly maps the oil industry, because the only real place for them to grow, because they need hard substrate, and all of the kind of rocks and the crags of the sea has mostly been damaged by trawling. And so it's more like a desert underwater. And so all the hard stuff for them to grow on is the oil rigs. And so when you see a map of where they grow, it's just a map of the oil industry. But they really grow amazingly on the legs of oil rigs and other like cold sea corals and things, but especially blue mussels. So yeah, I was calling them an oil critter because they kind of were proliferating because of oil, and other creatures that were kind of like acting quite ferally because of the oil industry. Like you can track quagga mussels that grow a lot in the pipes of London back to the Caspian Sea, and they've moved through Europe quite often because of different oil infrastructure and oil shipping routes. And now they like proliferate in the Thames and different like water pipes. And so all of these creatures are kind of like not enjoying, but like existing in a place and thriving in a place because of the industries. Those were kind of things I was trying to understand. I was trying to understand how ecologies were being remade also within our own city because of the oil industry, and like what kind of ecologies it was making.
And this kind of fits in with this other project you're doing with the Onassis Foundation when you're not at CLIMAVORE, called Cultivated Atmospheres. Are you already working on it, or is this what you're going to do? Have you started yet? What are you doing with the Onassis Foundation? I
started a little bit more, I guess. So my research and my practice has taken like a few lines since leaving university. As you said, my thesis project was looking at like this thing called pink death clouds that were emerging in the border regions between Russia and Norway. And it was looking a lot into kind of air pollution and how air moves.
Which is from the nickel industry, am I right in saying?
Yeah, in this case from nickel smelting. And it started a like big interest into like the politics of the atmosphere and different forms of air pollution and how like that lands and how it kind of like lands on the ground and how it affects people and plants. And so I've been doing projects collaboratively and independently around air in lots of ways. I've been doing a lot of projects around food through cooking sections and CLIMAVORE. And so this project, Cultivating Atmospheres, is kind of like my attempt at how I draw connections between them. And so often in both cases, you hear of like different kind of atmospheric conditions that are made by a food industry, or you might be looking into a certain food industry and you find that it has this whole atmospheric component. Like, for instance, ammonia is one of the most, is increasing the most as an air pollutant in the UK and beyond in Europe. And that's because of fertilizers, and it's because of industrial meat production. And it's one of the like fastest growing air pollutant when a lot of them are stabilizing. And so then you see that smog is actually something that's really tied to our food industry. And in other cases, you get kind of like locally specific.
Well, fish scales.
Yeah.
Fish scales in the atmosphere?
Fish scales in the atmosphere happen when, as I said, the fish meal factories that come to feed the salmon, in the processes that make this fish meal, there's a lot of discussion around like literally breathing scales, because they kind of become airborne, and then that causes lots of problems in the lungs because, you know, they're sharp and they cause different kind of like respiratory diseases. And so all these kind of locally specific ones too. And yeah, that's just something that I've kind of been following for a while. And in Onassis, I'm hoping to both write about this, write about it and maybe make a more kind of visual essay about it, but also speak to local farmers who are finding ways to address like wildfire risks in different ways. And most of that is kind of considering alternative crops and things that would reduce the risk of fire. And obviously fire is both, it's dangerous on the ground, but it's something that's so connected to air movements and wind, and you get like fire clouds as well. And it's a very atmospheric thing. So yeah, that's what it's not quite begun, but that is what the plan is when I'm in Athens.
It's fascinating. In terms of career path, you did a degree that has quite a designated route through it, architecture, as opposed to, I don't know, studying English or history, which I did. Do you have a sense of where you go with what you're doing ultimately?
Maybe I should. I think I'm someone who like I love a plan. I love to like write a 5-year plan out, a 10-year plan out, a whole life plan, and I'll never stick to it, but I like having a plan.
That's interesting. So when did you last write your last life plan?
I think like a year ago.
Okay.
I didn't write a life plan.
Career plan.
Yeah. And I think it's also partly because architecture gives you a plan. And I think I felt quite safe in that plan. Even when I thought I probably won't be an architect, I also felt like there was some structure there that if I wanted to, I could have it. And I think that felt good. And so the more I've moved away from architecture and the more I've kind of decided not to do certain things, I've been like, what's the aim here? How can I be like intentional with what I want to do next? And I think whilst like, I don't think architecture really gave me the roadmap of what my plan would be, I think more and more like the ways that we have developed work at CLIMAVORE and at Cooking Sections has given me a clearer roadmap of how I'd like to produce work in the future, and like kind of a methodology of making work. And that's something that, yeah, I've been thinking about a lot about recently, because I'm kind of exploring these other projects outside of the studio. And I think, I guess the main aim for me is to practice in a fairly similar way, but to work with communities to address extractivism within the landscape and think of kind of joyous, performative, community-focused events and installations or materials or whatever to do that. That's the main aim. How I get there, who knows? But I think it's like kind of to continue.
Yeah, I think joyous community events is a lovely, lovely way to draw this interview to a close. Rosa, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed that. Completely intriguing. Well, enjoy Athens.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me. It was a great chat.
It's a complete joy. Thank you. To discover more about CLIMAVORE, go to climavore.org, while you can find out more on Rosa at rosawhiteley.com. As ever, to find other podcasts that I've done and to sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. There are also images relating to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. Oh, and remember, we are launching Material Matters Copenhagen from the 18th to the 20th of June at Gammel Dock in Christianshavn. There's plenty of information about it on our website. One more thing. It would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £3.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message, the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.